You've probably heard one version of the history of India's caste system, a story of ancient, unchanging oppression. But what if there's more to it than that? Today, we're going to dive into an essay that offers a pretty controversial alternative view, one that really challenges how we usually think about this history. We're going to break down its core arguments, and it all starts with a very provocative claim. So, right out of the gate, the source we're looking at makes this powerful statement. It's not just saying the history's wrong, it's calling it historical slander. The author is basically arguing that a huge part of India's identity, and the Brahmin community in particular, has been totally misrepresented. And that idea, well, it's the foundation for the whole shebang. So this really is the heart of the debate. The story most of us know is about a rigid, birth-based hierarchy that's been around for thousands of years. But this essay asks us to hit pause and consider a completely different timeline, one where the system we recognize today is actually much, much newer and was shaped by forces from outside the culture. Now, to build this case, the author does something kind of unexpected. Instead of starting with historical dates and facts, they begin with a famous story from the ancient epic, the Mahabharata. It's called the Bhagavad Gita, which means the Song of the Butcher, and the whole point is to establish a key philosophical idea before we even get to the history part. So let's meet our main character, a guy named Koska. He's a Brahmin ascetic, and he's gained all this incredible spiritual power from his practices. But here's the thing, he's also really proud. He kind of thinks his birth and his holy lifestyle make him better than everyone else. One day, he gets annoyed at a bird and, poof, incinerates it with just an angry look. A little later, he's getting impatient waiting for alms from a housewife, and as he's about to lose his temper again, she just calmly stops him and says she knows exactly what he did to that bird. Kausika is floored. I mean, how could this ordinary woman possibly know his secret?
And this is where the story takes a huge turn. She tells him her power doesn't come from intense meditation, but simply from doing her duties, her dharma, with total sincerity. And then, for the ultimate lesson in humility, she tells this proud, highborn ascetic that if he wants to learn the real truth, he has to go learn it from a butcher, a profession that was seen as pretty impure at the time.
The butcher's lesson is really the philosophical core of the author's whole argument. He explains that real spirituality isn't about your job title or your family tree. It's about how you live your life and do your duty, whatever that might be. The big takeaway here, according to the source, is that the original philosophy was all about sincere action, not social status. Okay, so with that philosophical foundation in place, the essay makes a hard pivot to history. The author argues that to really get India's past right, we first have to understand the difference between two words that often get used interchangeably, varna and caste. Now, this is absolutely crucial to the argument. According to the essay, the word caste itself is a European import. The original concept, the author says, was varna, which was all about a person's qualities and their role in society, and it wasn't necessarily fixed at birth. This distinction is the bedrock of the entire historical case we're about to unpack. So if we run with this idea of varna, the picture of early Vedic society looks completely different. The argument is that it wasn't a rigid ladder, but more like a harmonious system where different jobs were all essential parts of a bigger whole. The focus was on doing your duty, your dharma, not on climbing some social hierarchy. But that raises a big question, right? If the system wasn't about exclusion, then where did marginalized groups or outcasts come from? The essay suggests a practical origin, not a religious one. It argues that in the early days, villages would banish criminals for safety. Over generations, these groups of banished people formed their own separate communities, leading to segregation that was born from simple geography, not from some sacred law. The author also points to another distinct group, people who were isolated just because of where they lived. You know, communities of forest dwellers or mountain people who lived outside the main towns by choice. In this view, their separation wasn't because society rejected them. It was just a result of their lifestyle, far away from the hustle and bustle of city life. All right, now we need to talk about a key piece of scripture that's right at the center of this whole debate, the Pursha Suktam. It's a really famous hymn from the Rig Veda that describes how society was created from the body of a giant, cosmic being. And how you interpret this hymn, well, that's where things get really contentious. And this slide just lays out the two opposing views perfectly. The author is pushing for the symbolic view on the left, that the hymn is a metaphor for a unified body where every single part is essential. In this reading, the feet, which represent the Shudras, are actually revered because they're the foundation that everything else stands on. The view the author is arguing against, on the right, takes it all literally, seeing it as a blueprint for a social hierarchy and a justification for oppression. So if the original system was flexible and symbolic, as the author claims, what happened? What changed everything? The source points to two massive historical turning points: foreign invasions and, later, colonial rule. This timeline really lays out the author's whole historical narrative in 3 acts. It begins with what's described as a flexible Vedic era based on Varna. The first major change, the source says, came with Islamic invasions, which started to harden those social lines. And then finally, the British colonial government comes in and basically codifies all these divisions, turning them into the rigid, birth-based caste system that we're more familiar with today. According to this source, the British played a huge role. It alleges that to weaken local power, they specifically targeted Brahmins, who were seen as the keepers of knowledge. The author claims that missionary writings were used to create this whole narrative of Brahmin oppression, which helped justify the classic divide and rule strategy. And the final piece of the puzzle? The formal census, which took these fluid social groups and locked them into rigid, official boxes for the first time. To push back against the idea of a permanently rigid society, the essay gives a specific counterexample: the Reddys of Andhra Pradesh. The author claims this group wasn't originally aristocratic, but they rose to power through military skill after invasions wiped out the old leadership. The fact that they were accepted by society is presented as proof that, hey, social mobility based on merit was totally possible. Okay, so that's a ton of history, but how does this retelling of the past connect to what's happening right now? Well, the author draws a direct line from this historical argument to many of the social and political debates happening in India today. And this brings us right to the author's main point about the modern world. The essay contends that a lot of the anti-Brahmin sentiment we see today isn't just a simple reaction to age-old oppression. Instead, it's a direct continuation of that colonial era narrative, a story, the author insists, that was basically created for political purposes. This is the author's powerful closing statement, and it's really a call to action. It's urging people to take another look at the past so we don't keep perpetuating what the source calls colonial era lies. The danger, in this view, isn't repeating past mistakes, but repeating past misinterpretations over and over again. And that kind of leaves us with this final big question. The essay we just walked through is one heck of a re-examination. It really challenges a dominant narrative, and whether you agree with it or not, it forces you to think about the incredible power of the stories we tell about where we come from. And it makes you ask, what really happens when those foundational stories are called into question?